Welcome everybody to another WOW session with Women's Warehouse, and today is a very special WOW session because we're coming to the end of our 16 days of activism, and as you guys know, we have been really intentional with our campaign. 16 days is not enough, there is no vaccine for GBV, and I just want to say to you guys, if you haven't had a look at our March pictures and what we did through our activations, please educate yourself, go and have a look at what we did to highlight the plight of women that they go through on a daily basis. And today is very special because we have a very special guest, and she's made a comeback. Tracey is here, she's the CEO of Mental Health Initiative, and today we're going to be talking about sort of something that's a really big issue in our country, and it's a stigma that's attached with gender-based violence, and Tracey's going to go more into it, and that's shame, guys. For me, in the personal speaking from personal experience, shame was a big part of my journey when it came to gender-based violence and the situation I found myself in. But just talking to Tracey prior to this WOW session, there are so many moving parts to what shame can do and the role that shame plays in gender-based violence. So stay tuned with us. We want to give you information, and you know how we feel. Empowering the education is what we do. So guys, please, I'm going to hand over to Tracey. I'm just going to ask Tracey, I'm going to start, just get it rolling. What role does shame play in gender-based violence?
Jen, it's a bit like asking what role does water play when we talk about wet.
Oh my gosh.
It is so intrinsically and inseparably linked. Because shame requires silence and secrecy and darkness to thrive. And that's where GBV lives, right? That's where victimhood lives, that's where perpetration lives. We want to cover up that we've been a victim or a perpetrator, and so we feel shame of being victimized or having perpetrated. And in some ways it serves to set people up for becoming a victim or a perpetrator. So it's really inseparable. The whole GBV discussion is wrapped in a very thick layer of shame. So for us to begin to stop breaking the cycle, we need to understand what that shame is and how it's living in society.
So you're telling me that perpetrators act in a form of shame? Is that what you're saying? Is it not only a victim? Because you really think that shame is a victim-based emotion, shame is a victim-based, scenario.
Sure.
So you're giving me info here that it's actually not. It actually is double-sided.
It is. So sometimes we make the mistake of dehumanizing perpetrators. Like there's some monster out there, you'll recognize them on sight because they've got like a third eye and extra arms. They're not monsters. They are human beings that are in struggle with issues, and those issues are emerging in dysfunctional behavior. So let's begin by saying perpetrators are human beings who are in struggle. And part of that struggle is that at some point in their own lives, usually in childhood, there's been an experience that has implanted a deep sense of shame. And then you add on to it the patriarchal expectations of masculinity.
Oh wow. Yeah.
Men are not even allowed to have feelings, never mind talk about their feelings. So they bottle all that up inside. And then of course, when they're perpetrating, they know that the perpetration is wrong. They feel regret, they feel guilt, they feel shame, but they're stuck in this dysfunctional behavior cycle that they themselves can't break. So the important thing there is to remember that when we see them as humans that are struggling with something, we can start to understand that yes, they feel shame. They are not emotionless monsters. And we can't help them heal unless we first start recognizing that they are humans in pain, and part of that pain is shame.
And are there programs that focus on this? Looking at, obviously, let's stay on the perpetrator for now, and then we can move to a victim base. Obviously, looking at any form, because you mentioned addiction as well, but any form of addiction, the first step is to acknowledge. So we look at narcissists, toxic masculinity. Narcissists are never, and I could be wrong, guys, but they're never going to admit that they've either done something or have a problem. Where do they go? How does this come about?
Sure. So just a word of caution on using psychological terms in pop psychology.
Okay.
And I'm guilty of it too. So it is what it is. But narcissism itself is is a diagnosable disorder.
Really? Okay.
Right? So it's an actual condition, and that person would need treatment. It's not just a random set of characteristics.
Wow.
So we're borrowing from an actual diagnosis or diagnosable psychiatric or psychological condition, and we're kind of just grabbing that terminology and throwing it into pop psychology to mean anyone who thinks a little too much of themselves.
Okay.
So let's just, and we're all a little narcissistic. We're all a little bit about ourselves. So it is a scale of, it's like a scale of intensity.
Okay.
When we're talking about actual narcissists who have been diagnosed as having narcissistic personality disorder,
okay,
then there's some proceed with caution type of stuff. But then also, if that person has been diagnosed, we understand that there are unchangeable things about them, and we either learn to love them with it, or we work around it, or we decide we can't be in relationship with people who have that diagnosis. In the world, when you meet people who have narcissistic type tendencies or characteristics, I would again be looking for what is the wound underneath.
Okay.
For me, there's always, when there's dysfunctional behavior, there's always some component of wounding that has not been resolved that is driving the behavior. But it's a case-by-case basis.
Okay. Can you tell me then, I'm going to throw it out there, because obviously those words are attached when you speak in a lot of gender-based violence stories. Are all narcissists perpetrators of gender-based violence? Are they all?
No, absolutely not. Just like not all women are feminists. I know it sounds weird saying it, but it's true.
Okay.
Not all women are feminists. Not all narcissists are GBV perpetrators, because what creates a perpetrator is quite a complex set of circumstances and characteristics and triggers, and you can generalize to some extent or make a prediction to some extent on somebody's likelihood to perpetrate or not. But you would require a battery of assessments run by psychiatrists and psychologists to even begin to cover that ground, because it's incredibly complex. I want to take a step back, if I may, about what sort of interventions you asked earlier are for perpetrators.
That's what I'm, how do we get to that place?
So there are some things that are now emerging for perpetrators, and I want to be clear on this before I continue. Not all perpetrators of violence are men. Obviously, women perpetrate violence all the time. But when we're talking about gender-based violence, we're talking about the fact that in specifically gender-based violence, as a definition, women are primarily, and women with the X in the middle, including the LGBTQ community, are primarily the victims, and perpetrators are primarily men within that specific definition. So taking nothing away from the fact that women sometimes perpetrate against men. Having said that, there's very little spaces for men to go and talk about what's bugging them. Socialization, and it's starting to shift now, so for our next generation it's going to be a bit better. But in the past, men were socialized to suppress their emotions. They were only allowed masculine emotions. So a man in anger is acceptable. A man in rage is acceptable. Right? A man drunk and disorderly is acceptable. So there was certain aggression was acceptable. Being assertive was acceptable. Yeah, like being manly, being masculine. Squash all your soft feminine feelings. Don't need a hug ever, because that is a soft feminine feeling. But they feel the same stuff we feel. They just didn't have permission to express that. They were only permitted to express these things in box 1 and suppress the things in box 2. The inverse is true for us. We can express the things in box 2, all soft feminine stuff, but we have to suppress our anger. The only time a woman is allowed to be angry is in defense of your child. Every other time you'll be judged for it. Think about that. So if somebody's doing something to my child, I can go raging crazy, but you can't like throw some expletives out in traffic, road rage. People look at you like, oh, but that's not ladylike. That's not feminine. So please get back in the box with your anger. It's not allowed here. So when you recognize that we have been required to suppress a full set of emotions, the anger, the assertiveness, the aggression, and when we do that, we're called bitches. Yes, we're not allowed to have those emotions. And then men being required to suppress the other half. And then you can see the duality of the pain. Both sides are in pain because they've simply not been allowed to be whole, expressive human beings. You can only express this little piece. And men have not been given the spaces to start integrating and having those human conversations yet. There are few places, but it needs to be everywhere.
It's funny that you mentioned that. Actually, I'm just recalling a conversation that I was having with Nadine. So you couldn't be here today, so we're just myself and Tracey.
She's here in spirit.
Yeah, she is. 100%. You know, she drives the cause and she's heading this mission that we're on. But we were actually talking about, you know, integrating a lot of programs in schools for boys and girls. So I would say, like, looking at, you know, age-appropriate content to identify red flags for girls, understanding what is appropriate, what isn't appropriate, if someone is engaging with you, and boys as well. We tend to forget the boys, but through the 16 days of gender-based activism against gender-based violence against women and children, we've actually been highlighted a lot. We were at the Department of Correctional Services, we were invited to their forum, and they were talking about men as well. So, you know, it's something that we do want to explore, but obviously you need to understand the subject matter before you can speak about it. And looking at gender-based violence and being a woman, we often see the other side of it. We're the ones that are the victim or the survivor, or whatever you want to call it. So I think that's such a powerful step to take in saying, but what about the guys? What about the men? And understanding the humanity. But let's put them in a box that non-perpetrators, gender-based violence. Now we're looking at the shame attached to a perpetrator. How do we engage with something like that without shadowing the scenario from a woman, what a woman is showing,
without taking it
away?
I want to ask the question by telling you a little story about my own personal experiences and what's been unfolding in my life, because I think it's a living example of what you're talking about. My mother was a survivor of incest. And so she was abused for 5 years before her father, who was the perpetrator, abandoned the family. My father married my mother not knowing that this was her history. But it was playing out in the secret places. You know, in the marriage, behind closed doors, these things were playing out in an incredibly toxic way. What we saw as children was that my dad over time started drinking more and more. He was binge drinking more and more, and then over time became violent. So he was binge drinking and had those alcoholic rages where you actually remember nothing the next day, smashing the house up, beating people up, putting people in the hospital. What I'm now doing with my dad, and this is present day stuff now, my dad and I are talking about how my mom's history affected him. There was no place for him to go for help. There was no help for people of color, no one cared. And even if there was help, I doubt they would have been able to afford it. So these two, 20 and 21 years old when they got married, were trying to negotiate and navigate. Oh, and I was born like 5 minutes later after they got married. So they're 21 years old, they've got a baby, they're trying to figure it out, there's no help. My dad doesn't know the history. It's playing out in a toxic way in the relationship. And just over time, the shame just built up. And the helplessness of a husband who couldn't help his wife, who didn't know what was going on, who felt emasculated in the marriage, over time layered over, and by the time they were 10 years into the marriage, my father was an uncontrollable binge drinker with incredibly violent, explosions. So I tell you that to show you that the story of the man takes nothing away from the story of the woman. But when our lives intersect as they do, and when we speak about GBV, where we're living in the same household as perpetrators, we have intersecting lives. You know, and it weaves into each other. So the pain of the one is getting pain for the other, which is their pain, and it just cycles through. So you can't say that the experience of the woman supersedes the experience of the man. Although it's probably a controversial thing to say. There are people who would want to say it's women are the victims and it should be all about the women. But for me specifically, it's two sides of the same coin. You cannot heal one thing without recognizing how that wounding is coming to be with within perpetrators because they themselves were victims of something at some point.
Okay, but then why are the statistics so vast in difference? You know, from female to male perpetrators. I mean, we don't want to take anything away from the current situation, but statistically, it is staring us in the face. Women are dying every day. I mean, I looked at in Nelson Mandela Bay. I mean, they had how many dead bodies that were just in shallow graves thrown away. So, like, we've got to I enjoy sitting and talking to you, but for me, there's got to be some sort of perspective. Why is it so easy? Why are these things happening?
Sure.
Without losing the sight of, yes, there are men that have gone through trauma, but we are sitting in a world where it is unrealistic that women should be living the way like
Sure.
So so why are we sitting here? Why are we here?
So we're talking about a social system which is bigger than all of us and will be around long after we are not. In order to end GBV, we have to change an entire system, but it's a system that's actually hundreds, if not thousands of years old. And there are pockets of things that you could draw from to answer this, Jen, but we can have a conversation about just that question for days. So when we go back to the emotions that women are permitted and men are permitted, right there you can see why women would be powerless. We're not allowed to be angry, we're not allowed to fight, we're not allowed to express rage. So we are already defined as powerless. There was a study done, I'm going to lie if I misquote it now, but there was a study done, which I know for sure, that was defined, Brené Brown quotes it in her work, where they looked at what defines being feminine. And the popular definition of feminine is be polite and quiet and pretty and spend all your money being more pretty. That's feminine. So where in that definition are women even given the permission or the voice to have boundaries at all? And then when you invert that and you look at it for men, the fact that society is high-fiving the aggression means they've got permission to transgress against us. So the system is giving that whole GBV cycle permission to exist. And then there are deeper things, you know, the Judeo-Christian concept about Eve being the originator of sin in the world has already messed us up.
We're going to have another wild session about that, please.
So that already puts us like, the fall of man is because of woman, and so already more disempowering stuff. And we can keep talking about how the system serves to undermine the equality of men and women, and that sets it up so that women are the victims. You know, in a parallel universe, maybe Adam ate the apple, and in that universe, the victims of GBV are more men than women. So, I'm not to oversimplify it because in fact, it's to say that it is so complex. Religion plays a role, our cultures play a role, the laws of the land play a role, the way people are educated or not educated play a role. Add socioeconomic pressure and poverty, that's a hot one that plays a role. And then of course, when people are so deeply wounded, as men and women and South Africa is a wounded country. We're not over the apartheid legacy stuff, and we know this because of what happened in July with the riots.
Yes,
we are a deeply wounded nation, and we still are that. I was having a conversation with White friend who was saying that she carries such deep generational shame because she's aware of what some of her ancestors had done to perpetuate apartheid and actually uphold that system. And she's so deeply ashamed of that. What happened 200 years ago doesn't even have anything to do with her. But it was her immigrant, family that kind of added to the. So that is part of what we need to heal. So if you have an unhealed nation, how can we love and respect one another on just a human level before we even talking about a gender level? It's hard. And so we numb, right? We're a society of numbers. We numb. I'm tempted to numb every time I drive past McDonald's. I will confess it. We have to manage it. But we numb.
And desensitized.
You know, I had a box of chocolates for breakfast yesterday morning because I was eating my feelings.
I see my feelings.
So, and that's the thing though, right? So we numb, but sometimes numb becomes super destructive, and that when we start talking about addictive behaviors, the addiction cycles, but you can't numb it forever. It eventually boils over some way, somehow.
And that's what
And we must remember that perpetrators are human beings in deep pain and struggle. So we've got to create spaces for them to actually speak about what's going on.
I think there's definitely something that needs to be discussed, and sort of, if there's action plans, I mean, we're very action plan orientated, or, you know, support structures, but it is definitely something that we found that was, people were asking us, well, what about the men? What about us? We are still victims, and we had that in our activations. We had Ronald beat up, standing and saying, I'm a victim too, and I think it's changing that mindset as well, that we need to embrace as a woman. The biggest, I think, lesson or the biggest healing would come when you be able to embrace and forgive that. But I think that's a long, you know, we still need to get to the point where we're actually making ground just on GBV. So so we've spoken about the perpetrator, how does a woman, how does this shame tie in with the women, other than the obvious that you are a victim, the victim shame? I went through it. I was like, how could I even let this happen? Being the person that I am now, she's always been there. How did she die? Or how did she fall asleep for that amount of time?
Sure. Because you feel some sense of responsibility for what is happening.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
And so I want to differentiate between feeling a sense of responsibility, because I think it's important that we do. It's important that we own what happens to us in the world so we can change it.
Yes.
So I'm not a huge fan of it's not your fault. Another controversial thing to say, but I'm going to stick with it. The thing is not your fault what's happening to you. But at some point, it's happening to you because you're in that situation by choice. And yes, there are many circumstances that add to why a person is in that situation. So I'm saying that without judgment. Because my mom was in that situation with my dad, right? So it was a lived reality for me. But if we don't say, hey, I am in this situation because I've chosen myself into it somehow, then we never have the power to choose ourselves out of it. Then it's always someone else's power. We're always waiting to be rescued, or we're waiting for an abuser to stop their behavior, or we're waiting for a miracle, we're waiting for the therapy, or we're waiting for them to stop drinking. But if we don't say, hey, I need to own some portion of responsibility for how this is happening, we can never change it. So I think some amount of responsibility is good. But wholesale absorbing the blame is not good. So there's two distinct separate things. Perpetrators must be responsible for their behavior. In fact, every human must be responsible for their own behavior, right? People don't make people do things. There's circumstances and there's thought processes, but we must own how we are showing up.
And how we react to things.
In terms of victim shame, a lot of it is to do with an underlying thought that says, but how did my judgment fail me here? How did I not see it sooner? There were clues and I didn't catch it, but now when I look back on the 5 or 10 years, I'm going like, oh, there are all the clues lined up, but I missed them at the time. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is shame that's implanted in childhood. And I want to make a distinction here that childhood shame is quite different from adulthood shame. Because children have an egocentric view of the world, and they must, because that's how they survive. In a child's world, the child is the center of the world, and all the adults in their world spin around them, meeting their every need. And in order to survive, they must inherently trust the people around them.
Correct.
So when they go ahead and they extend that trust, and that trust is violated, they feel like there's something wrong with them. Like they inherently feel like they are wrong. They are not lovable. They are not worthy of being loved and protected. They are inherently wrong. And when we outsource our parental responsibility to, say, a teacher or a coach as a pseudo caregiver, and that person violates the child, it's a further violation of the trust, because the child extends trust to that other adult because you gave the okay as a parent.
Correct.
And so children are already powerless because they depend on the adults around them to keep them alive. Why would you snitch on the person whose job it is to keep you alive? It's sort of the most fundamental part of the shame of childhood trauma. And so if daddy's abusing me and I snitch, daddy goes to jail, we end up homeless, living under a bridge, mom, and children make these leaps of imagination into like because that's just how they're wired. And so they understand the repercussions of, if I tell what's happening to me, there's going to be repercussions for the whole family. So they absorb the shock by not telling, sometimes not telling. Other times, it's just your trust has been extended and it's been violated. And it's been violated so often. And mommy and daddy are giving permission for this other person to be in your space as a teacher or a coach or whatever. So there must be something wrong with me. I am a broken thing. Oh. And when you carry that into life as an unhealed wound, it actually sets you up to become a GBV victim in later life again, because you don't know how to put boundaries. Does that make sense?
Absolute sense.
And I'm oversimplifying things a lot, but I'm trying to show you how the dots connect over time.
So, coming back to, do you think there's programs that we could put in place to identify these for children? So looking at gender-based violence, so I'm talking not from a child molestation scenario, or if there is trauma, the root of trauma, how do we help them overcome that to identify red flags for the future? Because obviously they're going to go into the cycle again, meet someone, even gravitate to people in that scenario, because I mean, it's there. I know what I stem from it. I vowed I would never marry someone like them, and I did. I married the personification of it. So for me, it's how do I prevent me? How do I help me? Do you know what I'm trying to say? It's like I look at it and go, how do we do it in schools? Because my generation, we're the cycle. We're already etched in our ways. How do we break that for women? We've got to support them. But how do we break the cycle for our children?
How do we prevent kids from being set up from the start?
And saying, okay, I understand this when this happened to me, but I've been taught that this is not okay. This is not okay. So what would you suggest in those scenarios? You know, is there child-appropriate content?
The complexity with children is that we can do stuff at schools, but they still have to go home. And if it's happening at home, it's happening at home. And it becomes very complex because you're trying to immunize them against something that they're constantly being exposed to. So that is incredibly complex. But the virtue of doing things at school is that it is the single biggest system in any country that everyone has to go through.
Yeah.
So it is a 12-year container. Yes. And over 12 years, if you build it incrementally from year one, over 12 years, you can bulletproof them to some extent. Right? And that's not discounting the randomization of life sometimes. But you can make them more aware, build their confidence, build their sense of inherent worthiness, build their understanding of respect for the fellow human, and just highlight the common humanity. As human beings, we have so much more in common than what could ever separate us. So if it's a values-based education program, that could go a long way, because those values then also live outside of the classroom. It lives on the sports field, it will live in their jobs as they grow older. So it's not just about saying, oh, if somebody touches your cuckoo, you must, scream out loud. That's obviously part of it. But it's more about having, I wish I could put this in a bottle of water and just give it to everyone so that it was, absorbed somehow. But it's having the inherent knowledge that I am good and I am enough.
Absolutely.
And my body is holy ground. Yes. And I am respected as I respect another. And if someone violates that boundary, to have no voices that silence my voice as a child. I must be able to be a 5 5-year-old kid and say, oh, you just touched me inappropriately, uncle, it's not okay.
Yeah.
Why can't you teach a 5-year-old kid, why, as soon as they can speak, they should be able to say that?
Yeah.
And I mean, so it's learning the boundary setting, but if you don't feel inherently worthy, you can't put a boundary. Because you're putting a boundary around what?
Yeah.
You know, that sense of self is so important.
And that is where I think South Africa, or a country globally, through social media and, you know, the instant gratification of having everything at our fingertips, I think that's where we're falling short, is that the sense of worth or the perception of perfection is also the downfall. And I love social media, it's what we work with every single day of our lives, but there's this other dark, ugly side to it that I think, and I see it in men, but I know in girls, young girls, women, pre-teens, teens going, it's that constant trying to live up to, or trying to be perfect, or trying to feel worth through perfection, where I think there's a lot of this stuff, you know, sort of settles itself or plants seeds, and we inadvertently water them. We water them on a day-to-day basis. You know, so for me, it's sitting and I can see the cogs in my mind are doing, like, how do we fix it? You know, it's what we just want to fix and help and nurture. But I think if we have these conversations, and, you know, we were talking about how do we, and you said to me, like, not normalize shame, or like, how do we normalize these conversations? How do we start? You know, where do we start?
So there's the system up here, and then there's our individual lives. And I think the only place you can start is in your individual life. Start where you are as a human being. Start with the way you're engaging your partner, with the way you're engaging your children. Be more mindful. You know, I say to my boys, they're 10 and 18 now, so I'm raising sons in this world, right? And I'm very careful, like, please Lord help me get this right, because to be a boy child in this time when GBV is such a topic, and I want to raise conscious boys.
Yes.
So that's another way to show up, is in the way you parent with consciousness. But I don't get it right all the time either. For me, it's, and what I say to the boys is, install a policeman between your head and your mouth. You know, they do that on the radio with live broadcast. There's actually between a 3 and a 5 second delay where if somebody says a swear word, they can beep it out. So install that person in your head, and before you speak something, just run it through a filtration process. Like, is this okay? Is this offensive? You know, does this body shame someone? Is this subtly racist? Is there some kind of ism coming through in what I'm saying? Is it pure of heart? And then it can come out of my mouth. And sometimes they blunder. I blunder. I think everyone blunders.
Absolutely.
And we will say to each other, like the connection is broken. And that's how it lives in my household. It's a very conscious, deliberate effort to parent with awareness. And they will blunder, and then they course correct. You know, sometimes they'll say, oh, I just said that, but now I'm playing it back in my head and it actually wasn't okay. I'm going to reword it to this. So, and we're living it. And when they do it out in the world, it's the same thing. We are going to say the wrong thing, we're going to upset someone, we're going to step on someone's rights, we're going to violate something because we're humans trying to be in the world. But can we do it mindfully of how it's affecting the other person? And once you're living it in yourself, and then you're living it in your household, and you're living it in your business, and you're living it in your streets, it's the same principle as if we all swept our own fronts to be step, then the country would be clean, right? So take responsibility for how you are showing up, and then it'll have a ripple effect. And that applies to the system as well, because the system that we talk about as if it's this disembodied thing, it's not a disembodied thing. It's created by people who occupy those roles, the leaders in local, provincial, national government, in corporations, in non-profits, in faith-based organizations. Those are human beings. And so the same would apply to them. Imagine if the leaders in government were showing up with that same idea of let me clean my own step and make sure my own act is clean, and then you add them up, and then the little drops become a tsunami of change.
And I also think what we need to all remember is that we're all broken. We all have a seed of trauma. We've all gone through something, and the stigma attached to when someone confides in you, we spoke about on Friday. Be inclusive, be conscious, be mindful. Put the policeman. Are you going to say something that's going to be helpful, mindful? Is it going to build a person up or break them down? I think that's a big step for us together, and that's why these conversations are so important, is because we don't have all the answers, but we want to educate you through the experts that do. So I think we've got, I want to thank you, Trace. I want to thank you so much. And this is going to be, you're going to see her again 2022. We're going to be wrapping up for the year, but it's something that we do want to have on a constant basis, because I think it's so powerful, because you bring us all the sides. We fight in this fight, but we also need to be mindful of, how big this thing really is, and how everybody plays their part. And that's why we're speaking to corporate South Africa. That's why we're going to government. That's why we're marching. That's why we offer workshops, and that's why we do what we do. It's not for anything but to change the woman's lives. Seeing a woman that identifies with abuse and understanding it's not her fault is because you've created a safe environment for her to be and be open and be, you speak the truth. It's powerful. So, guys, if you have any issues or you do want to discuss more, Tracey is the CEO of the Mental Health Initiative. You can send your questions or anything through to hello@womenswarehouse.co.za. We will help you where we can. Next year, 2022, is going to be massive. Nadine will tell you more about it. But Tracey will definitely be on our panel again. We want to have more people involved to give you all the information that you need to make informed decisions, educated decisions, and use wisdom in these situations. So thank you so much for joining us. Tracey, is there anything else you want to say?
Just one correction, it's mental wellness initiative.
Sorry, mental wellness initiative. My apologies. It's mental wellness initiative. It's the end of the year, guys. Mental wellness initiative. Thank you so much, Trace, again. We will see you in 2022. We're going to do our final wrap up tomorrow, guys. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Bye.
Have a safe holiday.
Yes. Be safe. Be wise.